I'd like to preface this by saying that Akira Kurosawa is really, really amazingly good. Like, wow, really good. And I didn't really know this because I hadn't really seen many of his films until, pretty much this year. I'd seen Seven Samurai about maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, which I loved, but I just never got around to seeing any of his other stuff. Like, I saw Rashomon last year and I loved it as well, which is kind of what got me into watching Yojimbo and Sanjuro this year, which is what I'm going to talk about now. But, besides that, I've only seen Throne of Blood. And he has like 20 other films that I want to see, which is crazy. So prolific as a director that, even in comparison to other directors, you'll see a lot of very, very famous ones. You take like Tarkovsky, Kubrick, Hitchcock. Generally, those people have, Tarkovsky has like 7 in his entire career if you're excluding some of his really early stuff. And, they're all very critically acclaimed. I'm talking about their, most critically acclaimed films, but Kurosawa has like at least 20. That's pretty amazing going in and watching his films, and you can kind of see why they're like that. He has such a presence in his films, and I'm not talking so much like, he has a style, and all, good directors have a style that they have, but his is more intangible. You'll look at someone like Kubrick and you can identify, it's a Kubrick film, it has certain like visual elements that are very, very specific. Like, okay, a lot of his shots are very symmetrical. His stories are kind of similar. Some of his dialogue is very cold, very, very long. Tracking shots, lots of very neat tracking shots. Then you take someone like, Bela Tarr, who has such a recognizable style. His films are incredibly long, almost silent films in parts, very, very bizarre, kind of surreal elements, kind of like magic realist elements almost. At least in Workmeister Harmonies, there's kind of a Kafkaesque vibe. So those are like a very, very definable traits to each of those films, but Kurosawa has more of like a feel over his films rather than some very, very specific elements. Like, there are specific elements in his films. Like, he always loves to do telephonic tracking shots where he'll focus on someone in the distance between other objects and make them track along, so it looks like things are passing by faster in the foreground and the background, which makes chasing things and moving things look very, very fast and really neat in comparison to other objects in the frame. I mean, obviously also his visual style is pretty distinct in that it's very neat, and he has really amazing blocking, some of the best blocking I've seen in any film, where his characters are so beautifully positioned in the frame, and even where he'll kind of do a long shot that'll transition into a static shot, and then his characters will all be positioned really beautifully in terms of lighting, spacing in the frame, just, really wonderful framing. Nothing extremely distinct as, like watching a Kubrick film and going, that is a Kubrick film, immediately picking up in your head, but there's still the vibe, like, wow, okay, I know that this is a Kurosawa film. The reason I stress that Kurosawa has such a distinct feel to his films, like a real power to them, is that I love Yojimbo, but it's not traditionally the sort of film I would love, or I really should love. Really, it's a very, very simple story, and it's kind of almost like a blockbuster, an old blockbuster. Very simple, very easy to understand plot, simple characterization, but done with just perfection, just incredibly. Normally films that I would rate this highly, and I do rate Yojimbo very, very highly, would be, very, very long, often complex philosophically and kind of thematically, and there'll be character arcs, very, very long, winding, twisting films, but Yojimbo isn't like that at all, really. It's, the exact opposite. I've always wanted to stress when, talking to other people, and especially when kind of discussing films in general, that I don't automatically hate films because of their nature of things, like I don't immediately walk into like an action film and go, I'm going to hate this because it isn't a brilliant foreign philosophical piece. So I do try to give due where it's worth, and that really comes out in Yojimbo. Yojimbo is probably the highest rated film for me in terms of like this kind of genre of a very, very simple tale. A Fistful of Dollars is pretty much the next one over, and obviously A Fistful of Dollars copied Yojimbo. If you didn't know, Sergio Leone essentially copied Yojimbo shot for shot and character for character, plot point for plot point in his Fistful of Dollars, and then got sued for it. And I'm actually not sure what the outcome of the suing was, but I mean, it was essentially plagiarism, complete plagiarism. But that's another film I rate very, very highly because of how very, very well done it is, in a similar manner to Yojimbo. But the thing is that it lacks the amazing energy that Kurosawa has, and I'm pretty sure that mainly comes from the fact that he directs and edits his films. He has this amazing and very, very quick pacing for early 60s, like 1961 was when Yojimbo came out. Very, very, very fast pacing and very quick, succinct shots, and beautiful movement between frames, That's actually an element that you can pick up on. But one that you wouldn't immediately notice upon watching one of his films is that he'll do cuts where it'll be a character's movement and then it will cut on the movement into like a close-up or something. So say, normally when you're doing cuts, you want to have like a 30-degree rule when you're cutting. So say you're not going to do a shot where it's someone's face and then you're going to do a 180-degree turn, because that's just going to confuse the audience. You want the audience to know exactly where they are every single shot of the film, unless if you're doing it for artistic effect. Kubrick in The Shining does 180-degree shots for artistic effect. Wes Anderson likes to do, face-on shots, like a profile shot, and then a complete reverse profile shot for kind of like a jarring effect, like an intentionally jarring effect. By and large, though, the rule is don't move your camera more than 30 degrees around, because otherwise it's just going to, discombobulate people. But for the most part, Kurosawa doesn't break that rule. But when he does, he'll often edit on the movement of someone. So say someone will pull out their sword and it will cut to a close-up of a continuation of the movement. So you have the link via movement rather than the link via imagery, which is really, really clever. And it doesn't restrict you to, just shooting in angles. So if he wants to really go for a close-up, then he'll do it on movement. And it just makes this really incredible. It's almost like a kind of like you're watching a play unfold. And it's kind of funny saying a play because a lot of his films are very Shakespearean. I mean, Throne of Blood is literally just the story of Macbeth. Anyway, enough prefacing from Kurosawa. Yojimbo, the film, 1961. The story follows a Ronin samurai, essentially, in the feudal era, the Warring States period. It's pretty much when all samurai films take place. And a Ronin, a rogue samurai, goes into a village and essentially pits these two fighting gangs against each other. Pretty much like every other samurai film ever made, it deals with the decaying state of the world, and most importantly, the growing unimportance of the samurai class, industrialization coming in. So the main antagonist of this, played by Tatsuya Nakadai of Harakiri fame, and most importantly, The Human Condition fame, which is a film I love. He's also in a lot of other Kurosawa films, and that's why his character is a man with a gun, essentially, the only man in the village who has a gun. But this film is just perfect, as I was saying. It's very, very simple plot, characterization, but beautifully done. The cinematography in this film is just exquisite. Like, some of my favorite out of the Kurosawa films I've seen. Obviously, Seven Samurai has really, really amazing cinematography and really, really amazing everything, essentially. This has some very, very clean shots. And like I was saying, the blocking in this film is just fantastic. There's one shot in particular which I'll show now that I just absolutely love, where we have the two gangs, coming together to clash, and you just see Toshiro Mifune just perched upon this watchtower, just watching the two, and the frame just comes so beautifully together with this wide angle lens of kind of being able to see the swords coming in, and he's just perfectly up in the center. Fantastic. Beautiful. That's a real art to do that without making your film overly stylized. Like, that's the thing. His films aren't extremely stylized, but they have his touch on them. A very, very definite touch to them. This is also pretty much a perfect example of how you do an action or like a fighting-oriented film without purely relying on fighting. It's essentially about the character of Yojimbo, Toshiro Mifune's character, of course. Toshiro Mifune is essentially the main character in the majority of Kurosawa's films. He's in Seven Samurai, he's in Yojimbo, he's in Rashomon, he's in Throne of Blood, he's in High and Low, he's in Bloody, he's in everything, and he's a fantastic actor. Even though the characterization isn't extremely in-depth, beautiful, arcing, it's just simple enough to get through the story, and complex enough, really. When I say simple, I mean it isn't complex. Simple often has the connotation of it being overly simplistic, especially when you're talking about a film. You say, oh, that was a little too simple. When I'm talking about simple, I'm really talking like exactly what you need without any of the crap. And you can have things that are complicated. Having a complicated character arc in this film wouldn't have worked. It happens to just work for other films which are longer and more character oriented, but this is more just a really, really good blend of just enough characterization, just enough action, beautiful cinematography, just enough plot, kind of like a really interesting winding plot, really, of Toshiro Mifune essentially manipulating both sides. And it's clever, very, very clever actually, without being particularly particularly convoluted. It's very simple, a kind of back and forth understanding how he comes to his conclusions of how to manipulate people in a way that's, clever without being too dumb for the audience and having to explain it to the audience. It's often explained visually, which is really, really lovely. I actually rate this film a 96 out of 100, which seems very, very high, and I really do have to stress that I don't rate really any other films of this type this highly. I did consider this for a while, and, I don't have many films past 95, maybe like 20 films over 95. Really, it's pretty much just for the reasons stated above. You really need to see the film to kind of understand what I'm talking about, like the energy of the Kurosawa films. And if you have seen it, then you probably know what I'm talking about, especially with like the way he edits the films and the way all of it comes together into this perfect parcel. And the great thing is that I'd pretty much recommend this film to everyone. Like, there's nothing overly complicated about it. There's nothing extremely philosophical or any strange artistic methods that would really deter anyone. This probably wouldn't even bother many modern audiences because the pacing of the editing is so fast. It's really magnetizing in a way that I haven't really seen for many other films. I'm not someone who's often even drawn into films. I often kind of watch things as more of like an objective observer. It's kind of like watching a play unfolding before you and you're just kind of sitting there going, wow, that person really, really knows how to make a film and make a film just work. It's, beautiful dance, essentially. Dance of film. So, Yojimbo had a sequel only a year later in 1962 called Sanjuro, which I'm also going to talk about kind of briefly. Straight off the bat, I'm not an enormous fan of this film, and I consider this quite a step down from Yojimbo. That's for one, because it isn't amazing. It's still a very, very decent film, and something I'd recommend generally to people, with kind of a spoiler tag that I'll kind of add on at the end of this. It's also because it would be pretty hard to top Yojimbo. Yojimbo, as I was saying, was really, really amazing, and having a sequel, I can understand why they would do that. It would be pretty easy to do it after seeing Yojimbo. It's a very, very open story, and you can pretty much do anything with Toshiro Mifune's character. Being a sequel, it essentially operates in the same way that many other sequels do. It essentially copies the first film. To be fair, it isn't a direct copy, but it's very, very similar. It's Toshiro Mifune's character helps a group of samurai to help them overthrow some corrupt lord that imprisoned one of their uncles or something. I'm struggling to remember exactly what the plot was, but it's very, very similar to Yojimbo in the sense that it's Toshiro Mifune manipulating groups of people to his advantage and having a series of side characters that he's helping and kind of working through that sort of stuff. Sometimes kind of quippy and sarcastic, generally interesting, and it's done pretty well for the most part, and there are some moments of brilliance. As always, the cinematography is pretty fantastic, the editing is pretty fantastic, but my main issue is that the writing and plot just isn't as good as Yojimbo. Yojimbo works because every part of the film is pretty much perfect. Like, everything works fantastically. Every scene is just like, wow, okay, this is really good. Every single scene. Sanjuro doesn't really have that. It's a little slow in places and not for the right reasons. Like, dialogue just kind of goes on a little too long. It actually does get a little bit convoluted despite being as simple as Yojimbo was. It'll stay a little bit too long on ideas that should have easily been understood by the audience. And on top of that, there are some really, really weird and very, very awkward, out of place comedic scenes, like weird slapstick comedy in very, very serious places that is just a total like, whoa, okay, I guess that happened. And it really pulls you out of the scene. It's really just tonally like a complete mess in those scenes. You'll have a serious scene and then you kind of have people kind of being really slapsticky and like very serious. And this is happening in a scene where it's like they're waiting to find out if someone's uncle is going to be like executed or if they're dead or not. And, they do this kind of awkward, someone I think stubs their toe and they're trying to like keep it down because they're near this corrupt lord's house, and it's just, what are you doing? It's just really bizarre. But that's not really the main reason I would deduct marks. Like, definitely, it's really bizarre, and it happens a few times in the film. It's kind of, there's a recurring joke with this one character who keeps on getting locked in a cupboard, like that's the joke. Some of it's like a little bit amusing, but it really still shouldn't be in the film. Yojimbo has its funny moments, but it's more of like a very, very dry comedy rather than like a laugh out loud comedy, which is what they're kind of trying to go for in this. My main complaint mainly comes from the fact that it just isn't as strong as Yojimbo. And Sanjuro is pretty much what I expected Yojimbo to be when I first went into it, and then it just exceeded my expectations by being fantastic in every way possible, pretty much. The main thing for me, plot-wise, is that what was so great about Yojimbo is seeing the way in which Mifune's character manipulates different people. And the way he does that is so clever, but at the same time, so kind of obvious and apparent to the viewer, and understanding, exactly what outcome's going to happen by doing certain things and, telling people certain select information. It's really fun to, see certain things play out between people who are completely being deluded by this one person. But that's really reduced in Sanjuro when the manipulations are a bit more contrived and are a bit stupider. That kind of just ends up besmirching Mifune's character, because it makes him either look like an idiot or someone who is just completely pulling shit out of their ass. That really just kind of ruins a lot of the fun of the film, on top of the fact that it's kind of weaker in a lot of the elements of Yojimbo. It should be noted that Sanjuro actually has actors from Yojimbo playing different characters in it. Like, Mifune plays the same character, but Tatsuya Nakadai plays a totally different character. I don't mind that, really, it doesn't matter that much. It's just a bit weird watching Yojimbo and then going, oh, okay, I'm gonna watch Sanjuro, and then you're like, oh, you died in the last film. That's a little weird. Anyway, I'm giving this a 79 out of 100. Even though it's decent, and that's a very, very decent score, mind you, it's a definite step down from Yojimbo. I mean, the film is still beautifully shot and edited and has some great acting, but it's still my least favorite Kurosawa that I've seen to date, mainly because all of his other films are so good that they're just, such an elevation above this. It's kind of weird seeing his films have very, very definite flaws and missteps. It's kind of like, oh my god, you actually made a mistake. That's really weird. I pretty much recommend this, like Yojimbo, to most people, unless if you're extremely averse to kind of awkward slapstick comedy. I wouldn't recommend it as highly as Yojimbo, obviously, but it's still a very, very decent film, and watching it after Yojimbo won't retroactively tarnish your memory of the film. It's not gonna ruin any elements of Yojimbo. It's just a very, separate side story. So that's about it. If you're confused about what the numbers over there mean every time I pop up a film, then I just released a video down here where I discuss essentially what all of that means and that whole rating system in a very, very comprehensive manner. It goes for about 25 minutes. That explains all of that and kind of how I am going to be cataloging my films. I'm considering reviewing more Kurosawa films as I watch them. I've still got a lot to go. He has a lot of films. Wonderful. I love this guy. And I love this guy. If you love him, then love me. Please, love me.